Sing, O muse of the liminal one, he who shatters the boundaries, dances upon their pieces, who comes to the broken, forlorn, agonized, and extends his hand in acceptance where they are. Hail to Dionysus, who knows no boundaries of gender nor place, rattler of the thyrsos, he who recognizes no rank or class, bringer of madness, healing, catharsis. Just so y'all know, this video is almost certainly going to be demonetized. The stuff I'm talking about is going to be absolute kryptonite for the algorithm. Because this is Dionysus, and everything about Dionysus is found on the peripheries. Let's take a look at the gender and societal bending qualities of the mad god. Karate. This is one of the coolest videos that I've ever had the opportunity to research, not only because I'm a member of the LGBTQ+ community, myself on multiple axes, but because Dionysus is an incredible deity with so many different branches under his auspices. His most well known are wine and madness, of course, but he is so much more, and I haven't seen the community talk about the rest of his aspects near enough. He has his hands in healing and treating mental health issues, with the perpetual reminder from the channel that religion should never replace evidence-based treatment, only augment and support it, mystery cults toward a better afterlife, the unconquerable wilds, and his worship upended nearly every societal norm in ancient Greece and Rome, including and especially gender norms. In fact, after all the research that I've done thus far, I've come to the conclusion that even in ancient times, before we had solidified concepts such as gender identity, the very liminal nature of Dionysus and his cult places him as a god to whom any trans person can turn for support. This is without having to stretch the evidence very far to a modern view, as you'll see in part 2. The Romans even banned private bacchanal rites in 186 CE for fear that this secondary equalizing hierarchy created by his rites could present a threat to the state, both in terms of gender and, as we'll see later, in terms of social status. According to Walter Burkert, this meant over 6,000 executions of people just for wanting to practice these rites, though this figure does come with some controversy as it stems from a single source. By modern standards, this would be a religious genocide. Kinda reminds you of some certain actions being taken by a certain political party against those who cross the gender binary lines that they said in the modern day. Anyway. In order to see why the state might have found Dionysus and his Roman equivalent threatening at the time, we need to take a deeper look at one of his less discussed aspects, the way his very presence and rites themselves break societal norms and encourage a form of radical equality and acceptance not ever found in ancient society's day-to-day life. This video will be divided into 3 parts. The first, we'll talk a bit about Dionysiac rites and their relationship with societal structure, how their very existence broke that structure down, and why that might be important for modern worshippers seeking his aid. The second takes a look at Dionysus as a figure with feet on either side of the gender spectrum, a definitively male god with a phallic procession in his most well-known rite, who was described in very feminine terms in the work that sheds the most light on how his followers viewed him. And finally, we'll take a look at Dionysus's seemingly mythological abstinence, aside from his wife, who he ascended to godhood. As always, sources are listed in the description below, so you can dig deeper into any of these topics. And if you happen to be new here and haven't subscribed before, maybe consider hitting the subscribe button and/or the like if you'd like to be able to help me out with producing more videos. There's a link in the description also to my Patreon and Ko-Fi if you find my work worthwhile and would like to help me continue doing it. I wouldn't be able to actually do so if it weren't for the assistance of the community. With that out of the way, Part 1, the liminal god. What is liminality? It's an important place to start when talking about gods like Hecate and Dionysus, who dwell on the edge between Uranic and chthonic cultus, and on the fringes of society despite having a civic cult. Cult here means the actions taken by worshippers to honor the gods, such as offerings, dances, music composition and performance, acting, etc. Liminal is a term that means on the edges or the border, sometimes defined as on both sides of said border. It can also mean a transition of some kind from one state to another, usually used in this way as an adjective to describe a period of time or a specific act. This include both metaphorical borders, such as delineations regarding gender expression, or literal borders, such as a beach being a liminal space between land and water. There were many different forms of Dionysiac ritual, but the most distinctive we have records for were liminal rites that bent the line between common gender expressions and eliminated class divides during the length of the rites themselves. This border-crossing character even extended to the ways that he was represented in his cults. The way the gods and their worshippers are represented during rites, both in art and during the rites themselves, can tell us a lot about how those deities were viewed by ancient people. His most common agolmata, or icon for worship, and the oldest, is a post, pillar, or tree trunk, a mask, or a mask affixed to that post, pillar, or tree trunk. Quite often, it would take the form of two masks affixed to said pillar or tree trunk, each facing opposite directions. Masks represent liminality in two ways. The first is what is presented versus what is hidden, which is a much more modern take. Humans are psychologically very primed to identify one another using our facial features, so hiding one's face has a profound impact on how one is perceived. Once one's face, and thereby identity, are hidden, the features of the mask can replace them, and what you wish to present takes over. Hence, some people referring to others misrepresenting their beliefs or opinions as wearing a mask, or neurodivergent people hiding their natural thought patterns and habits as masking. To the ancient Greeks, masks represented his doubleness or duplicity, his title two-formed, which also appears in the Bacchae. This is the symbolism behind the masks on the pillars facing two directions and often having two expressions, something we'll see later in theater symbolism to this day, the smiling mask of comedy and the frowning or depressed mask of tragedy. This duplicity also extends to his mythology as well as cult presentations in numerous ways, the most obvious of which being that in his various origin myths, he's undoubtedly Greek, and also historically seems to be unanimously Greek, but is presented as a foreigner from Thrace, Lydia, or sometimes in later history, India. In the Bacchae, he comes as a stranger from Thrace to visit his own birthplace in Thebes, disguised as his own priest, bringing a foreign rites of a quote-unquote new god to his hometown. This duplicity can also manifest in giving up one's own personality and identity to that presented by the mask, as an actor does when taking on a role. Modern Chinese and ancient Greek theater both make and made extensive use of masks, with specific cultural connotations to identify characters and the tropes associated with them easily. These theater masks were often made of linen, leather, wood, or other light materials, and had massive holes in the eye area and the mouth area to allow actors to see and project their voices beyond the stages they performed on, as back then they obviously didn't have microphones or speakers and had to make use of outdoor acoustics provided by the rounded shape of the stages themselves. The exaggerated expressions on the mask were paired with exaggerated movements, so that even those sitting in the far back rows could easily tell what was going on, how the characters felt, etc. They also allowed the actors to face the back of the stage and switch characters mid-scene, taking on a whole new identity, including potentially changing vocal pitch, with credibility to the change lent by the mask. Some modern YouTubers and TikTok stars actually continue with a similar trend with modern tech, changing costume, vocal pitch, and mannerism to put on one-actor plays and skits to great effect with the help of selected editing and rapid cuts between scenes. The audience is asked to suspend disbelief, same as in ancient times, in order to follow the story being told. These masked identities and the suspension of disbelief provided by the theater environment during the Dionysian ancient times allowed both comedy and tragedy to become genres that enabled playwrights to criticize the then contemporary issues in their society, particularly in Athens where the Dionysia was held, without as much fear of social reprisal or destabilizing the state. A particularly good actor was said to be possessed by mania, a force originating from outside the self, and often was said to come from the gods. I covered mania and performance briefly in my video on the topic, link is in the iCard if you missed it. This form of possession was said to infect the audience with the frenzy of the actor or the performer watching and listening to the performance. Sight was a crucial component of this sort of possession. So too, the Bacchos, a particular type of male worshipper of Dionysus, is said in the Bacchae, line 470, to be possessed and the rites revealed through sight, which is a major theme in the play. Sight and identity, masking and deception, are the major themes throughout the whole of the Bacchae, and they're exemplified in lines 912 through 924, when Dionysus is preparing the perpetually impious Pentheus to infiltrate the monastic rites performed by his mother, sisters, and other women in Thebes by disguising himself as a girl. This is while Dionysus is still disguised as his own priest and has an ulterior motive, where Pentheus believes he's cross-dressing as a maenad to infiltrate a rite that he sees as blasphemous to put a stop to it. Dionysus is actually preparing him for a punishment for denying his divinity. Dionysus. You who are eager to see what you ought not in hasty pursuit of that which ought not be pursued, I mean you, Pentheus, come before the house, be seen by me, wearing the clothing of a woman, of an inspired Maenad, a spy upon your mother and her company. Pentheus emerges. In appearance, you're like one of Cadmus's daughters. Pentheus, oh look, I think I see 2 suns and twin Thebes, the 7-gated city, and you seem to lead me, being like a bull, and horns seem to grow on your head, but were you ever before a beast? For now you have certainly become a bull. Dionysus, the god accompanies us, now at truth with us, though formerly not propitious. Now you see what you should see. Pentheus here has been driven mad by the power of the god and sees double, the god and the bull, and Dionysus tells him he sees rightly for the first time in the play, though too bad for him because it's too late and the audience understands this. There's a tender moment just before where this dangerous god tucks Pentheus's hair away and compliments how pretty he looks, while Pentheus is worried about how convincing his disguise will be. This moment of seeing double happens immediately after, as Dionysus is reassuring Pentheus that his disguise is going to work. The form of the bull and the man here are juxtaposed with Dionysus's disguise as his own priest, while Pentheus in the scene is himself adopting the affect and persona of a Maenad, believing that he is to infiltrate their rites. Duplicity and deception layered on duplicity and deception. Instead, Pentheus quote-unquote becomes the animal which the craved Maenads hunt, and as Dionysus possesses them and makes them see him as a wild creature in the woods, which they then tear apart. He ends up being sacrificed, which brings 2 layers of Agos, or divine wrath, on his family, one for the denial of his godhood, and the other for the human sacrifice and cannibalism that Dionysus causes his mother and sisters to do. Keep in mind, in sacrifices in ancient Greece, the thigh bones and fat were burned to the gods, but the meat was prepared in a feast, often boiled or roasted, with wine being poured over the roasting meat and dripped into the fire to create sweet knise, or offering smoke. I covered that more in depth in my video on what the ancients offered, link is in the iCard if you missed it. But we don't just have the ancient texts themselves to reference when we want to learn about these rites. In fact, due to the secretive nature of many of his mystery cults, a good deal of what we can discern about them comes from representations of these rites on various vase paintings. There are certain standard tropes in the way that figures were represented on these vase paintings that we need to understand in order to view these vases the way the ancients would have, and thereby understand what's going on in them. For example, in Greek art, showing a character from the front is rare, except for extreme predators or fearful entities like panthers and gorgons, depicted on armor and shields from the front. Anyone possessed by Dionysus in his revelries is depicted front-facing on vase paintings that we have surviving from the 6th centuries onward, particularly men dressed as satyrs, maenads, ecstatics, actors wearing masks, musicians, and pipers. Dionysus himself also appears front-facing from time to time, in part because his power resides largely in possession and madness. We'll get more into his associations with wine in a later video, but wine was said to pour, quote, like hot blood, unquote, upon an altar in ancient times, as altars were often outdoor pillars upon which animals would be sacrificed or libations poured to the gods. Many of his aspects include things which spring up: hot blood, vines, especially grapes, fountains, young shoots, calves and chicks, young people, and wine, which was described in ancient times as boiling when fermenting, as the action of the yeast and other microorganisms released gases and heated up the fermentation vessels with their processing of sugar into alcohol. Because of this, it was frequently referred to as liquid fire. The ancient Greeks actually diluted wine as they believed it could kill you undiluted, in part due to the influence of the god and due to the deep sleep one would enter if one got too drunk. This dilution was referred to in many translations as mixed wine versus unmixed wine, which was offered to the gods directly. The vessels which contained the wine often had the face of Dionysus sculpted or painted onto them, and sometimes wine itself was referred to as Bacchus, such as in a fragment of Euripides' play Kuklops. Wine affected rich and poor, women and men similarly, releasing inhibitions, loosening tongues, enabling procreation, and causing a form of relaxation similar to that felt by those who watched the works of the Musai performed by bards as referenced in Hesiod's Theogony. All these various aspects combine to portray a god whose rites and worship abolish societal identity and replace it with a ritual context, a great equalizer who recognizes neither gender nor class, nor societal authority beyond that of the gods and himself. Tiresias points this out in the Bacchae, when he says in lines 200 to 209, "We mortals have no cleverness in the eyes of the gods. Our ancestral traditions, and those which we have held throughout our lives, no argument will overturn, not even if some craftiness should be discovered by the depths of our wits. Will anyone say that I do not respect old age, being about to dance with my head covered in ivy? No, for the god has made no distinction as to whether it is right for men, young or old, to dance, but wishes to have common honors from all and to be extolled, setting no one apart. Translation. Dionysus doesn't care about your age, your gender, your social status. He wants your worship all the same. His dances are for all. This is a radically different approach than was taken by civic worship overall, where some rites fell exclusively to aristocratic houses or genes passed down in family lines, where some were only available to registered citizens of the city-state, which was a very small percentage of the population, by the way. And some altars were accessible only to men or to citizens themselves. Although there were some rites open to all and some altars at which even medics or citizens of other city-states who were not citizens of the one where they lived or slaves, women, or children could offer, society overall was rigidly defined into strict hierarchies where one's place in said society determined where one could go and what one could do. This is another obligatory channel reminder that I don't support bringing this aspect of ancient worship into the modern day. There are some things that just aren't useful or are now recognized rightfully as unjust in modern society, and in my opinion, this sort of rigid structure falls under that category. Boundary crossing in Dionysiac rites especially included gender, particularly in the private rites put on by private priesthoods in non-state-sponsored mystery cults, as cross-dressing was a component of many of these liminal rites, and Dionysus himself was depicted in clothing typically gendered for women and was called androgynos, or man-woman, by Pentheus in the Bacchae. Speaking of... Part 2. Androgynos. I'm gonna need to give a trigger warning for most of this section, as the way in which boundaries were crossed in ancient Dionysiac rite, apart from the cross-dressing which we'll get into, it could very well cause psychological harm if done by modern people, especially those with trauma. Trigger warning for non-consensual acts described with as little detail as I can while getting the point across. These were both depicted on vase paintings as part of ancient rites and very clearly a part of said mystery celebrations, particularly for women, so I can't avoid talking about them. Me discussing them is not me endorsing any kind of modern-day reproduction for said triggering rites. Again, my trigger warning isn't about the cross-dressing, it's about the scenes of attempted non-consent and fending off that we'll get into towards the end of the section. Dionysus is often shown in a mitra, a clothing item that prior to the 5th century BCE was gender neutral, but post-460 BCE was considered almost exclusively female dress. In the Bacchae, we are told that long peploi and the mitra are women's clothing, during part of the play where Pentheus is disguising himself as a maenad. Pentheus? In what clothing? Female? But shame holds me back. Dionysus, are you no longer eager to view the maenads? Pentheus, what clothing do you bid me to put on my body? Dionysus, I will spread out hair at length on your head. Pentheus, what is the second part of my outfit? Dionysus, a peplos down to your feet, and you will wear a headband. Pentheus, and what else will you add to this for me? Dionysus, a thyrsos in your hand and a dappled fawn skin. Pentheus, I could not put on a woman's dress. Dionysus, but you will shed blood if you join in battle with the Bacchae. Nudity in depictions for men represented masculinity and virility. Dionysus is rarely portrayed as nude in vase paintings and statues when appearing as a fully bearded adult man, but rather is portrayed in the same clothes as his feminine worshippers more often than not. In the later 5th century, beardless and young depictions of Dionysus became more common and were sometimes shown partially or wholly naked, but this was explicitly not meant to be sexualized, as it was compensated for by a less virile image, a graceful and languid figure, as my collaborator on my video Kaz put it, by According to Dionysus and the Bacchae, his secret rites were primarily performed at night and primarily by women, though in the quote we saw in part 1, it's clear that men weren't barred from them. Cross-dressing for both men and women is widely attested in public and private Dionysiac cult. Lucian attests that during the Dionysia, someone in the court of Ptolemy IV refused to cross-dress during the Dionysia, and if he hadn't done so the next time, might have been kicked out of court for offending the king. Someone at the court of that king Ptolemy, who was nicknamed Dionysos, slandered the Platonic philosopher Demetrius, for he drank water and was the only one of the company who did not put on women's clothing during the Dionysia. Indeed, if he had not started drinking early and in the view of all the next time he was invited, and had he not put on a Tarentine wrap, played the cymbals and danced to them, he would have been lost as one displeasing to the king's lifestyle. These cross-dressing rites and practices were so popular that in 692 CE, the church fathers banned them in a decree stating that no man put on women's clothing nor any woman men's clothing clothing, that they not wear comic, satiric, or tragic masks, that they not shout the name of the execrable Dionysus while pressing the grapes or pouring the wine into kegs. Apparently, they sucked at enforcement, as according to Eric Sapo, in the 12th century, Theodore Balsamon complained about the continued popularity of these practices in rural villages, even in his day. We have more than just Lucian for evidence of cross-dressing in ancient rites, however. Vase paintings depicting private rites show that some satyr-dressed men wore false breasts and some maenads wore perismata, or false phalloi, in imitation of the satyrs. Plutarch tells us that in the Oschophoria, 2 young boys, or ephebes, from noble houses were chosen for their feminine beauty, kept out of the sun and prepared with baths, had their skin smoothed, and were instructed in feminine impersonation to lead a procession for the rite. The Sudas tell us that the Ithafali, male worshippers of Dionysus, were cross-dressed in full-length chitons with embroidered sleeves for public and private rites, which, as we discussed earlier, were distinctively women's clothing. Komosts were male worshippers who have attestations from the Archaic period through Aristophanes' time and perhaps longer. They wore bodysuits with breast and butt pads to mimic a feminine form, with exaggerated pot bellies and limp penises, representing a loss of male virility and an adoption of a more feminine external mask. Reiteration of the trigger warning from the start, click over to the timestamp on the screen if you aren't in a place to hear about rites involving simulated non-consensual acts such as groping. Another sort, often lower class men on the social scale, were men dressed as satyrs. Satyrs are personified male lust as seen by the ancient Greeks and had both bestial and human traits, just like Dionysus being bull-horned in the Bacchae and in his cult titles. Erect penises were also a symbol of possession and were frequently associated with both satyrs and Dionysiac worship, as lust and romantic love were often equated in the Greek mind and were seen as a form of possession by Aphrodite, a type of mania, which I'll cover more in detail in future videos. Pentheus in the Bacchae, when he first comes onto the scene, actually accuses Dionysus, when he first comes to Thebes, as being more interested in Aphrodite than the god he purports to serve. Keep in mind, satyrs being erect and participating in these sorts of things we're about to discuss were portrayed significantly less frequently on vase paintings in the 5th century, but they're still important to talk about as these are some of the best sources we have on what early monadic rites actually looked like. Monadic revelry, as depicted in vase paintings, often showed ecstatic dancing wearing fawn skins, wielding the thyrsos, playing the aulos, snake handling, and fending off men dressed as satyrs. Specifically, the many Attic vase paintings depict maenads as fighting back against satyrs in pursuit of them in a more violent and lustful way, if you catch my drift. Dear Susan, have mercy. In some of the paintings, the maenads are asleep or reclining in apparent dance moves while being unwillingly fondled by the satyrs, but in many they fight back using the thyrsos, or the ritual symbol of Dionysus, which was a rod with a pine cone on the end, often wreathed in ivy. Boys, cross your legs. The maenads often hold the thyrsos at hip or groin height, aimed directly at the satyr's eggs. We'll call them eggs, which are usually exposed because their flagpole is standing at attention. In other words, it's clear that even if these were ritual dance moves meant to instill a sort of catharsis in interactions between the sexes, the wildness of the maenads did not make the attentions of the satyrs either willing nor warranted. One of the other rites that often occurred during these rituals, the spagarmos, included the tearing of an animal apart by hand, usually a goat. This is depicted on one side of a drinking cup by Epictetus, no, not the Stoic who wrote philosophy. You run into this problem quite often with ancient names. The other half of the cup shows Heracles with centaurs throwing rocks at him in the act of slaying them. Centaurs often have faces similar to satyrs, with a mix of bestial and human-like qualities, so an image like this would juxtapose the madness of the maenads with the heroic deeds of Heracles, symbolically by putting these two ideas side by side. This also equivocates the aggression of the maenads in this rite with the heroic aggression of Heracles, who was defined by his very masculinity in Greek eyes. These ritual dances sometimes ended with the maenads fending off the satyr men, who then had to get their absolution elsewhere. As in the images that depict the satyrs being fended off, there are often women being portrayed as concubines, not in ritual dress, waiting in the wings to satisfy the lust of the denied satyr men. At other times, these satyrs captured the maenads and consummated the act, which led to a lot of hemming and hawing by philosophers and the ancient equivalent of angry conservatives about the indecency of these rites. Hell, even Plato took a potshot at them when he talked about his ideal form of government. These rites allowed a form of catharsis, or a release of emotions not allowed for with the stifling gender norms of Greek society. In fact, they might have been essential to preserving the ancient social cohesion, as they allowed that release, which then enabled the worshippers to return to their ordinary lives, knowing they had another rite to look forward to in the future for a similar release of inhibitions. This is yet another reminder that I'm not advocating for a return explicitly to these sorts of rites in the modern day. That would open up all kinds of potential for ritual abuse and trauma triggering. But we can learn from what they were meant to accomplish and how the way they were practiced influenced how Dionysus was viewed in ancient times. The numerous gender-bending practices aren't a direct analog to modern transness, as it was implied that the boundary crossing ended with the rites, but it's clear that Dionysus himself has a non-binary element to his nature that places him in the position of a queer and trans god. Modern LGBTQ+ folks can turn to Dionysus for these aspects and for assistance, alongside proper care, with mental health issues related to dysphoria and transition, as Dionysus also played a role in mental health treatment in ancient times that I'll cover in a future video. That said, for all the sexual hubbub going on around Dionysus and his iconography, he seems distant from it all in yet another seeming paradox for the boundary-crossing god. Part 3. He Who Abstains. Remember that phallic procession in the Dionysia? In the source that I quoted, we really weren't told what the genital affliction was, but in a different source, we're given a slightly different explanation for its origin in another rite. According to Lucian, the original myth of Hauloa states that Icarius was an Athenian farmer. They said that Dionysus gave the vine cutting first to him, after whom the first vine was called Icaria, as well as the territory which grew the plant. This Icarius gave some of the fruit to Attic shepherds to drink. They drank it and then thought that the others, who were gripped in a deep sleep from wine drinking, were dead, and they killed Icarius, thinking that Icarius had given deadly poison, not only to those who were asleep, but that he had also given a potion producing madness to those who were awake and in a drunken rage. So this is how Icarius died. When they recovered from their drunkenness, Dionysus showed his agos toward them in the following way. He approached them in the form of a beautiful boy, drove them mad with lust, and encouraged them to seduce him. Then he immediately disappeared. The shepherds, seeing that he kept promising them to let them consummate their desires, were at the peak of excitation. Indeed, they remained in this state of unabated excitation as a result of the wrath of Dionysus. Afterward, they propitiated the god by making such ceramic forms, according to an oracle, and setting them up as votive offerings as substitutes for themselves, and they put a stop to the madness. In other words, Dionysus gave them an erection lasting longer than 4 hours at a time when calling their doctors would have been useless. The language is similar to the ancient explanations for the carrying of the phallus poles during the Dionysia. Note how, in his wrath, Dionysus teases the men but doesn't allow them absolution. Even in myth, he's involved in significantly fewer mortal or immortal sexual conquests than other gods, despite how woman-oriented his worship was and despite being surrounded by women at all times in his iconography. In fact, he was often depicted in marital bliss, unlike Zeus and Hera, and his marriage was used as an example in many rites of what a stable ancient marriage could look like. In the earliest versions of the myth with Ariadne, Dionysus pursued and then abandoned her or killed her for infidelity with Theseus, as per the usual patterns with the ancient gods. Ariadne, that daughter of subtle Minos, from whom Theseus bore off to Crete toward the hill of sacred Athens, yet he had no joy of her, since before that could be, she was slain by Artemis in the Isle of Naxos because of the witness of Dionysus. But according to Hesiod, and some other sources by the classical era and later, he instead rescues her from Theseus and makes her his eternal queen. This is more in line with how he's depicted in later vase paintings, often utterly smitten with Ariadne, who is sometimes depicted with their children in her arms or staring lovingly into his eyes. Instead of pursuing his own sexual desires regarding women beyond his wife as other virile male gods did, Dionysus instead acted like a mitigating force between men and women, in both cult and civic life. In cult, he was sometimes appealed to, particularly due to the use of wine, much like all forms of alcohol in the modern day, to facilitate the pursuit of objects of desire. For example, in a fragment of Anacreon, which according to Murgatroyd was likely a hymn written for personal appeal and not public consumption, we see a clear appeal to Dionysus to assist with the pursuit of a male companion the author feels as though he's losing. O Lord, with whom Eros the vassalizer, the cerulean-eyed nymphs and Aphrodite the radiant, sport as thou hauntest the mountaintop sublime, beseech thee thyself come kindly to me, and hearken unto my supplication. May it find favor with thee, wisely advise that Cleobulos clearly chooses my love, Dionysus. As an aside, I found this fragment really interesting for its intimacy and how clearly personal it was. And I found it as moving as some of the inscriptions on the votive offerings from when I did research for that video a few years back. Not because it's a heavy subject matter or anything, but because of how rarely we get to peek into how the ancient artists and poets would compose and pray for their own personal needs, rather than the needs of the city-state. After Kaz pointed it out to me, I felt I needed to include a full translation and commentary, if for no other reason than to show how short, intimate, and beautiful beautiful and very personal ancient prayers and hymns could be. We see all three parts of the prayer here. Link is in the description to my video on tripartite prayer if you missed it, as well as in the iCard if I've got any left. The first few lines identify gods Dionysus is said to spend time with and places he's said to be found, building the invocation and the argument together. Then, at the end, the request to aid with his troubles with his love is posed along with, finally, Dionysus's name itself. Basilizer here references Eros as a conqueror and subduer of the hearts of humans, as Murgatroyd puts it, and the references to the nymphs and Aphrodite conjure images of young people falling in the throes of love, linking Dionysus to her arts via the facilitating medium of wine and merriment, but also the sexual nature of his rites is mentioned in part 2. In such a short poem, we see an intimate and personal look at how a poet viewed this god in his personal practice. Anacreon, for the record, would be considered bisexual by modern standards. He wrote about the pursuit of men, women, and unfortunately for modern sensibilities, but normally for the time, boys. Another reminder, I do not endorse pederasty at all, ever, for any reason. That said, as a poet, he was spoken of with admiration by many of the later ancient authors, alongside Hesiod, Homer, and Pindar. So these poems were influential in ancient times, and his more personal fragments give us some insight into how personal prayers from the poets may have looked. As I mentioned before, in iconography where Dionysus appears with his maenads, it's rare to see him depicted naked in his adult form. Typically, he's shown with a full ankle-length chiton covering his phallus, which was seen in ancient times as a male sign of sexual virility. Even in the images with his wife in marital bliss, his phallus is often covered by either clothing or blankets, and he's rarely, if ever, shown pursuing anyone other than his wife in iconography or myth. Dionysus may have had a ton of stuff going on around him, we'll call it that, but he himself does not seem to participate, instead of becoming a force which bends and dissolves the regular, rigid gender roles and lines for the duration of his sacred rites. All of this adds up to a strange, fascinating, and seemingly contradictory god. A god of the phallus whose cult primarily was run and practiced by women, who himself rarely, if ever, participates in the sexual revelries he inspires, who ensures the preservation of ancient order by destroying the boundaries of it during his sacred cult, to establish catharsis which then allows people to return to their daily lives renewed. Of any of the gods, who would understand the struggles of transition and the delicate navigation of modern gender roles better than Dionysus, whose epithet androgynos literally means man-woman? In ancient times, transness wasn't really a concept the ancients thought about as its own thing, any more than a specific sexuality as identity based on whom you find attractive wasn't really thought that way. But you don't need to take more than a quarter step to cross the gap between these ancient rites and their symbolism into modern-day LGBTQ+ experience, with Dionysus remaining he who dissolves those roles, who destroyed notions of class in his private rites, whose myths include the elevation of a mortal he loved to godhood, whose sacred marriage seems to be the least tumultuous among the gods. But let me know what you think. If you're new here, hunt the subscribe button when you're done tearing the like apart limb from limb. Drop down into the comments and let me know if you learned anything new, what your experience with Dionysus are like, and whether you can see the connections I'm making here. I also want to give a quick shout out and thanks to Kaz from the Heroes Aliakai server for checking over my work and conclusions and tipping me off about the fragment I discussed in part 3. Getting back to work was a struggle, and I really wanted to get this one right. Without your support, I don't know how confident I would have been putting some of these ideas out there. Special thanks also to my incredibly patient patrons. This video has been a long time in the making, in part due to a nasty car accident that kept me from working for several months, and in part due to the complexity and immensity of the material I needed to go through in order to make this work. Without your support, I wouldn't have been able to afford to do any of the work I've done. May the cycle of reciprocity between us ever remain positive. And remember, we're stronger together.